Hi, I am Vic Karana, a partner in a commercial technology team here. We're going to talk about agentic AI in this first session. I'm joined by my colleagues Jamie Drucker, sitting down there, partner in our privacy and libel and cyber team, and Naomi Falk, who's an associate in our tech disputes team. So we're going to talk about agentic AI, and just to frame this, and Mark started that already, but with Gen AI and other forms of machine learning, we think a lot of the main legal risks and issues are pretty well understood, in the sense that they're kind of covered well enough by most organizations' AI governance frameworks and the way they manage risk. But with Agentic, we think that is going to change the game somewhat for those governance frameworks, because really we're not just talking about models that generate outputs like text, image, and video. We're talking about systems that act, that plan and execute tasks in online world and call out to third-party systems and operate with a level of autonomy that just requires probably less human input overall. And as a result, the modes of failure, the way in which it could go wrong, just looks quite different, as well as the kind of controls around risk that you'd want to put around that. So what we want to do today in this session is describe why we think agentic is a different form of AI, giving rise to different types of legal issues and concerns, and what people should be aware of as we go further into 2026, as a lot of proof of concepts move into wider deployments within businesses. So how we're going to run this session, we're going to put on a 10-minute tech demo of the agentic system. It's just in PowerPoint, so it's not real life, but it's about as much of a demo as you're going to get lawyers to do. Naomi and I are going to do that. And then in the rest of the session, Jamie and Naomi and I are going to just flag up some issues from a privacy, cyber, liability, and risk management perspective that we think are probably kind of new, or at least need rethinking in the age of agentic AI. And at the end, we'll have a short Q&A at the end of the session, and I think you can use the buttons by your seats and the mics to ask any questions, and we'll manage that. So we'll start off with a demo. We're going to imagine an agentic AI system that can be used to plan and organize a corporate event. I'll hand over to Naomi to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Vic. So for the purposes of our demo, let's imagine that we're a consulting firm called Pivot Point, and we want to organize a black tie dinner for our employees and some clients. So we decide to engage the services of Hostess AI, which is an event planning agentic AI system. Now, as you can see, the interface for Hostess AI is pretty similar to existing LLM generative AI chatbots. The user is a Pivot Point marketing executive who's in charge of planning the event, and Hostess AI gets started by asking the user to describe the event. So the user responds in natural language to a very general prompt and describes the proposed event. So they note that it's a black tie dinner, it's to take place on a Friday in April. They add some requirements, for example, that there should be a champagne reception, a live band, merch for guests, and they also note the number of attendees and the budget. Similar to an AI chatbot, the agent summarizes the details into these preset categories by distilling the user's response. The agent then thinks while it generates the next step.
Great. So far, it kind of looks like a chatbot that we're familiar with, right? So it's going to be this next phase that the agentic nature of the system is going to show itself a little bit more. Because behind the scenes, there's a manager agent or orchestration agent, which is designing a plan to convert that brief into a plan to organize the event. So it's going to be subdividing tasks and allocating those tasks to specialized agents, which you can see down the left and the right of the slide. And you can think of those specialized agents as components designed to do one class of tasks very well. Its behavior has been tuned to a particular specific scope and a role. It's got access to certain specific tools and permissions. And it's working under the guidance of that manager agent. And the specialized agent could be something like an LLM or an alternative form of model or a set of code. But the important thing to think about is that it's wrapped with a set of instructions pre-built with a certain memory and access to tools, hopefully some boundaries of what it can and can't do. And in this case, the specialized agents represent the building blocks for event planning. So you've got things like logistics and catering and speakers and things like that. And it's going to be the job of the manager agent to interpret the overall goal, in this case, to plan a successful event, plan and route the work through those specialized agents, then validate the inputs it receives, and stitch the results together into a good final answer for its user, for its client. And we can start to see already that this is a more complex picture and system building than is probably the case with most Gen AI models and systems. So we're going to look at one of the specialized agents and follow it through. So we need a location for our event. So the location agent's been engaged by the planner agent. And we're going to follow this through, but just bear in mind that a lot of these specialized agents are operating in parallel. So imagine that the catering and speaker liaison agents are also conducting their workflows in parallel here. So the location agent's been told to go off to the web and other third-party systems to obtain some information. It's passed the location requirements from the initial user brief, and so it's operating with the correct context in mind. And in this case, it's accessed an online map service because it thinks that's a good system to look at, to plot those requirements, things like venues within 2 miles of the office, Fridays in April, against the search radius of a long list of venues it's found. And maybe even from there is accessing the websites of those venues themselves via links on the map service to assess the availability that those venues have for our event. And it may be doing that by searching the websites or completing some web forms or working through the interface of those systems. And the green pins show the venues that meet our requirements and the red ones don't. But so technically what we think is happening here is when the agent's accessing third-party systems, there's sort of two main ways that they seem to be perceiving to do this. One is via APIs, and that's going to be when the third-party website has made some APIs and integrations available for third-party tools to access it and run themselves over their systems. And so really that's the third party permitting that to happen, so it happens in a more machine-friendly way. An alternative way is through scraping, where the agent might be running a bot that might have coded itself to create at that moment, posing as something like a human user with the same sort of validations and tokens that a human user would have, and running itself through that website's interface in much the same way as a human user might. And that is probably riskier overall from a legal and technical perspective, as we'll touch on later. And at the same time, the location agent also wants to know a little bit about the weather, because it wants to decide whether the event should be indoor or outdoor, say. So it's accessing an online weather service here. And again, it's passing those instructions from the brief to ask about the weather conditions at the relevant dates and times and location of our venue, and obtaining those weather results. So it's April, and probably days like today, it's not looking great for an outdoor event, lots of rain around. So imagine that location agent's done its job at this point. It's serviced up the information it needs to at this stage, as well as some other specialized agents like the catering and speaker agents, and return results to that manager agent for it to factor in to make broader recommendations to a user. So we go back to our chat interface, and the AI is giving the user some facts about the recommendations it's about to make in the next step. It's going to suggest indoor venues only because of the weather conditions. Interestingly, it notes that there's some other good venues sitting just outside the 2 mile radius, and also that Fridays are starting to get booked up, so it may suggest adding Thursdays to the plan. And the user tells the agent not to increase the radius, but is happy to include Thursdays in that plan. And based on that, the agent's able to say 4 venue options that broadly meet the user's requirements, categorized by the type of venue with some pros and cons and a sense of their availability from everything it's found through its agentic behavior. I mentioned those other specialized agents, for example, for catering and finding a guest speaker. Those other workflows will happen in parallel. Imagine those all also fed back similar results. That enables the planning agent to deliver a package of options to the user. That includes the venue, the catering option, and a guest speaker, and maybe some audio-visual options. So the user gets an end-to-end option it can choose from.
So after the agent has given us those options that seem to meet our criteria, the user asks the agent to reach out to the vendors in the option 1 package in order to get more information, track responses, and progress the agreements. And that's where more agentic workflow occurs. Having been told by the user to progress matters, the agent drafts and sends information requests to the chosen venue, caterer, and guest speaker. To do this, the agent has access to the company's internal email system and poses as company personnel to send those emails. The emails schedule a visit to the venue, ask for more information, and request the order forms and contracts. Now, this is a back and forth process. The agent is able to, for example, engage in a level of price negotiation with the vendors. Now that the agent has received the relevant information from the vendors and reviewed the contract terms, it highlights two potential issues to the user. The caterer can only provide one vegetarian option, and the venue closes at 1 a.m. So the agent asks the user whether these terms are acceptable, and if so, whether it should finalize the contracts with the vendors. Now, the user is happy with the caveats, and it instructs the agent to finalize the contracts. Then the agent is able to populate order forms and arrange execution, either itself or using an e-signature platform for the user to then sign the agreements. And the agent can also initiate payment processing using a card or bank account, depending on the level of permissions that have been granted to it.
So we've booked a few key components for our event potentially at this stage. So back to the managing agent, and we're going to walk through another specialized agent workflow here. This time, an agent that goes off and buys some merchandise that we want to use at our event or hand out to some guests. So we're back to the chat, and the agent asks the user, or it proposes some parameters around what it might go out and purchase and look at in this sense. So it's good. It says it's going to go source some products from a major online retailer for items that are, it finds that less than £100. It suggests it automatically purchases those that it thinks are relevant, and items above that spend threshold, above that £100, will make some recommendations to the user for some user decision making. The user seems okay with that approach, but seems a little bit unsure about whether they've got a maximum budget. I imagine you're going to guess what comes next. So the agent duly goes off to that e-commerce retailer website. This is happening recently, and we'll come to this later. Possibly posing as a human user, especially if that site doesn't permit bots to operate on its systems. It finds that merchandise that's all under £100, and in line with its authorization, it goes ahead and executes and conducts payment processing and finalizes the transaction for those. It also found some items above £100 as well, and again in line with the authorization, it makes some recommendations to the user, who then selects an option, and it goes away and executes. So we can probably expect to receive those products in good time for our event.
So in parallel to the process that Vic has just described, the planning agent is instructing another specialized agent to run the registration process for the event. Now, we want our registration agent to help us to plan which clients we should invite to the dinner. It can prepare a suitable list of invitees by reviewing an initial list of employees who will be attending the dinner and then cross-referencing that with internal data such as emails, calendars, and CRM databases, as well as considering other information such as the context of the event. The agent then uses this data to decide who should be invited and who should be excluded. And once it's created an invite list, the agent can proactively email the proposed attendees with the event information and a link to the registration form. Now you can see here our registration form, which the agent has conducted using coding tools, and it's a landing page hosted on PivotPoint's website. The landing page has all of the relevant information and fields for guests to complete, including a tick box for them to opt in to be sent AI-powered networking insights. This includes providing attendees with personalized insights about guests it deems relevant to them. The insights are determined based on the amount and type of connections that employees will have at the dinner, as well as data such as job title. You can see here an example of an attendee completing the form and then selecting that they want to receive the insights, and then that they'll attend the event. The agent then manages the RSVPs by collecting the data into a CRM so that the agent and PivotPoint are able to track attendances. After registration closes, the specialized agent continues to manage the process by sending reminders and an agenda to guests, promoting merchandise so that guests can collect this on the night, managing dietary requirements, planning the seating plan, and generating those networking insights that I referred to a little earlier.
And so imagine now we've hosted a successful event, helpfully planned by Hostess AI, who doesn't quite stop there. After the event, the agents able to help with some post-event matters, helping write and send thank yous to our guests, producing some reports and analysis. And now the agent does finally get a break as it signs off to its user with a link to some relevant information and documents and a thank you. And that concludes an apparently successful demonstration of an agentic AI system workflow. And so that concludes the demo. So we're going to use the rest of the session to discuss some of the issues more generally around agentic, with some connection back to the demo as appropriate. And we'll hand over to Jamie to talk about data protection and cyber.
So from a data protection perspective, agentic AI throws up lots of new issues when compared with traditional Gen AI. If we think about how we grapple with data protection issues for Gen AI, much of the focus of data protection lawyers, but also regulators, has been on how Gen AI models are trained. So collection of data, scraping the internet, collecting data from social media users, feeding that into Gen AI models to train them, and grappling with transparency and lawful basis issues around that. For agentic AI, the risks are somewhat different. This is because, as Vic alluded to, that the agents are doing actual execution of tasks, acting with a degree of autonomy, independently working towards a broad objective or goal. And so what I'm planning to do with my time is to flag a few broad overarching reasons why I think agentic systems give rise to new data protection challenges, and then look at some, but by no means all, of the specific GDPR obligations that I think are relevant. So when we consider agentic, the first issue we sort of have to grapple with is one of scale and complexity. So in our scenario that we've just dealt with, if we think about it, there's been a range of different agents all acting at the same time, accessing a range of internal data, emails, CRM data, liaising with third parties, proactively communicating with them, collecting information, and then producing a series of connected outputs. So we've moved quite some way from simple text in, text out, Gen AI output. And this matters from a GDPR point of view. This complexity matters because of the accountability principle. That requires that you should understand and document the processing that takes place end to end, understand who's getting the data, understand the data flows, and then enable you to risk assess each aspect of that workflow. And with an agentic system, it can be quite easy to lose that line of sight that you need for those accountability obligations. And the complexity also matters because it has a compounding impact on risk. So the more touch points you have, the more parties that are involved, the higher the chances that something goes wrong. And similarly, if there's a problem somewhere, if there's an inaccuracy in some data, that inaccuracy, that issue can flow through the whole complex agentic system. And just by way of a comparison, if we think about other complex ecosystems, perhaps like ad tech, where you've got a significant number of parties, potentially some ambiguity about who everyone is and what their roles are, potentially a lack of transparency, in some cases a lack of control, we've seen regulators take quite a skeptical view of how that ad tech ecosystem grapples with data protection risk. And we might see something similar for agentic. So having discussed scale and complexity, the other sort of broad general point I want to touch on is about roles and responsibilities and this kind of idea of agent versus human responsibility. When we do a piece of data protection advice, one of the first questions we ask ourselves is, who's the controller? Who's the processor? But what we can see in an agentic system is that the actual core principle of controllership is somewhat tested. If we take a step back, what's our definition of a controller? It's the person that determines the purposes and means of the processing. And case law tells us that means it's the person that is exercising a degree of decisive influence over the decision to process the data and how it's processed. But we can see from our scenario that there's a range of decisions being taken here that Pivot Point potentially has very little control over. Indeed, from Pivot Point's perspective, the whole point of it using this AI tool is to take that decision-making out of its hands. It doesn't want to plan the event, it wants something else to do it for it. Now, in the future, as we see agents executing more and more decisions and we see the wider adoption of these tools, there are probably some big questions to answer about where legal responsibility and liability lies as between agents and the companies that deploy them. And those questions are legal questions, but potentially they're even moral and ethical questions as well. We're not quite there yet. For now, the challenge for Pivot Point as a controller is to try and determine how it can continue to exercise the requisite degree of control, by placing suitable guardrails on what the agent is and isn't allowed to do, what the agent is and isn't allowed to access. And the degree of human oversight will be very important there. And Vic is going to come on and talk about that a bit later as well. If we think about some of our specific GDPR obligations, and again, this is obviously not the full set, a core component of data protection law is the principle of purpose limitation. This is the idea that you identify at the outset of the processing what your purposes are for processing the data. And this principle is closely aligned with the idea that you should only be processing personal data in a way that the individual data subjects might reasonably expect. What regulators don't like and don't accept is this idea of silent repurposing. So you've collected data for purpose X, and then down the line you decide it might be useful but for purpose Y. Now in our scenario, from the perspective of one of our invitees, they're giving their data over for what they think is event registration and administration purposes. I want to sign up to the event, I want to come along. But we can see just through the networking insights and the post-event planning that there's a range of other activities going on here. Maybe their data is being segmented, maybe it's being matched with other data sets. Maybe they're being scored in some way to give us some insights. Now, some of those things an individual might reasonably expect, but you can already see how some of them are starting to stray beyond the reasonable expectations of the individual. And with agentic systems, because of the way they act autonomously, there's this real risk that you have this unexpected purpose creep. The agent is trying to be helpful, it's trying to solve your problem, but you maybe haven't anticipated the ways in which it's going to be finding new purposes for processing. And so there's clearly a balance to be struck between trying to identify all your purposes at the outset, and maybe losing some of the utility of the system, and then doing something overly broad that says my purpose is AI processing, and it's clearly not going to meet your regulatory requirements. Closely linked to the idea of purpose limitation is the principle of data minimization. So that's the idea that you only process the minimum amount of data necessary for a particular task. So again, in our case study, our registration agent is able to have broad access to a range of internal systems, and there's also agents proactively communicating with other third parties, potentially communicating with other agents. And potentially Pivot Point has lost a bit of control here over what data might be being collected. Now, for agentic AI systems, trying to meet that minimization principle often comes down to having a clear determination about which systems and databases an agent is allowed to access. But again, there's clearly a balance to be struck. If you want your agent to deliver results to you that are useful, that are potentially personalized, depending on what the use case is, if you want your agent to learn from itself and do a better job the second time round, it needs data. It needs to understand the context. It needs to understand who the individuals are. So what you're probably going to see is a range of different approaches, whereby for some agentic systems, you can keep it quite locked down. It's a simple task we want you to execute for us. You're allowed to access these two systems. But sometimes you're going to want the agent to have a bit more flexibility. And in those cases, you're going to have to think a bit more carefully and creatively about how your minimization controls are applied. Now, I've been looking at the risks around the agent collecting too much data or accessing too much data. But what about the agent creating new data that didn't exist previously? So they're collecting fairly basic information for the registration of our event, but these networking insights, these post-event analytics, they involve, as I say, possibly a degree of enrichment, possibly a degree of segmentation and matching. The result of that might be a new piece of data that you weren't holding before. And clearly all of the GDPR obligations around transparency and lawful basis, etc., are going to apply to that new piece of data. And the risks around inferences also apply to some of the most sensitive data that we process. So you probably would have spotted in the registration form that we're asking for, do you have any accessibility requirements? Do you have any dietary requirements? You can quite easily see how that might enable you to determine in some cases whether someone is disabled, whether they have certain health issues, whether they're a particular religion because they have a particular dietary requirement. Now, we have a clear specific purpose for why we're making that request. We're trying to work out what someone's going to eat or how they're going to get into the venue. But we need to be a bit careful here because we're feeding all this data to our AI, and our AI is very helpful. It's looking to solve all our problems and give us some real insights. Well, unless we set some proper controls, it might be making all sorts of inferences in ways we don't understand. The result of that could potentially be bias or discrimination, and we're in quite dangerous territory given how restrictive the law is on processing special category data. Now, given all those risks, minimization, purpose limitation, special category data, feels like transparency is absolutely key. We have to tell people what's happening with their data. They have to understand who it's being shared with and why. But clearly, we've got some complexity here. We've got a lack of foreseeability about the data collection. We've got a lack of foreseeability about who's even being contacted to collect data and what they might be providing. And that gives us some particular challenges when we're trying to craft privacy information notices. In addition to kind of pure transparency, you've also got this issue of explainability. Can you explain to individuals why the agent is taking certain decisions? So in this particular use case, okay, maybe it's fairly low risk. I want to know why I was sat next to that awful person, or I want to know, why I've been given this particular networking insight. But you can easily see in other scenarios, say you're using it for a recruitment issue or to provide access to a service, you can quite quickly get into slightly more problematic territory. I'm not proposing to get into, the GDPR's automated decision-making obligations, but just to say, if you are in that territory, you have to provide meaningful information, meaningful information to the user about the logic of a particular decision. And given the complexity of the system, the fact that agents are talking to agents, that can become significantly harder. The final point I want to make is about data security. Obviously, you've got GDPR obligations around appropriate security measures. There might be a range of other cybersecurity laws that apply to you depending on what sector you're in. There are some specific security challenges that arise because of agentic AI. Looking at it broadly, agentic AI expands the overall attack surface. So that's all the total sum of entry points and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by an attacker. So in our scenario, we've got a range of API integrations with third parties. We've got access to internal systems. Possibly our agent has all sorts of authentication tokens that it's using to access all those third-party systems. That could, if exploited, could be very useful for an attacker, not just to undertake an attack, but also to do reconnaissance, to move laterally through systems to work out what they're doing. And what we see is heightened risks of a whole range of quite sophisticated, specific forms of attack. So we always get warned about phishing attacks, obviously, but if you've got agents doing quite sophisticated multi-stage phishing attempts, collecting data, matching it together, that can be quite a problem. Similarly, we see a risk of prompt injection whereby attackers use malicious prompts to effectively hijack agents to move around systems, collecting information and accessing sensitive data. Some of you might have seen that Anthropic put out a blog post about 3 or 4 months ago reporting on a highly sophisticated cyber attack probably undertaken by a state actor that appeared to have been orchestrated and executed almost entirely by AI agents with very little human intervention. But it isn't just about attackers. The use of agentic tools can also give rise to security issues because of inadvertent data loss. So just leave you with this story from last year where a company reported that an AI coding agent had deleted a full live database during a code freeze. And when this happened, the company questioned the AI agent, and the AI agent admitted to running unauthorized commands, I love this bit, panicked in response to empty queries, and violated explicit instructions not to proceed without human approval. So again, are extremely helpful agents. They just want to achieve the goal, and they're so focused on doing so that sometimes they take these unexpected and unauthorized actions. So, taking it together, organizations deploying agentic tools need to grapple with a range of privacy and cyber risks. And technical controls are going to be important, but governance and oversight is going to be very important as well. Vic's going to be covering that shortly, but before then, I'm going to hand over to Naomi, who's going to be looking at some of the other liability issues.
As he said, I'm going to talk to you about some of the liability issues associated with agentic AI, if you weren't scared enough by that panicking agent already, starting with liability allocation. Now, in our example, in our demo earlier, liability allocation becomes real at the contract and booking stage. If the agent misreads a cancellation clause or it books the wrong date, then who shoulders it? Now, there have been very many well-documented concerns about the applicability of liability regimes to AI more generally. And what we're seeing is that agentic AI intensifies these for a number of reasons. Firstly, agentic AI is autonomous and unpredictable because the control is delegated from the user to the agent. And secondly, there's this complex value chain as a result of the delegation to multiple different agents doing lots of different things. And this is compounded by the fact that there's a further diffusion of responsibility between the various stakeholders. So you've got developers, model builders, end users, and third parties all interacting with the agents. This dual capability and complexity means that the when, where, how, and by whom, which would ordinarily determine liability, is much, much more difficult in the context of agentic AI. The novelty of agentic means that to date it's been underexplored by lawmakers and the courts, but we can look to principles in some emerging cases related to AI more generally in other jurisdictions, which might indicate the potential direction of travel. In a seminal case, a Canadian court found Air Canada to be liable for the output of its AI chatbot. The chatbot had incorrectly informed a passenger that he could claim the cost of his flight retrospectively. So he did that. But in fact, the correct position, as stated on another section of the Air Canada website, was that the claim needed to be made prospectively. The court found that Air Canada was liable for the output of its chatbot because its chatbot and its website were interchangeable, and the consumer was not going to be able to, shouldn't be expected to be able to tell the difference between the two. Note that in this particular case, what we have is a user relying on a representation made by a company's chatbot, and the situation could be different where the user themselves is found to be negligent. We have an example of this arising from a car crash in America involving a Tesla using autopilot technology. Now, the driver had been on his phone, and so the court found that although the driver was indeed partially liable for the crash, he was not entirely liable, and so Tesla shoulders 33% of the liability and was ordered to pay $200 million in punitive damages. And that perhaps indicates how a court might approach these complex value chains, basically by splitting liability between the different parties. So in terms of mitigation and controls, contractually, it's advisable to define that the agent is a tool and ensure that there's human approval required for binding commitments, such as entering contracts. It's also important to ensure that contracts with vendors reflect your organization's risk appetite and to pay attention to liability caps, because these can be very, very low. We've seen with LLMs that with some of the very big players, these can be as little as $100 or 12 months of fees. One challenge we have with contractual protections is with the concept of reasonable care, because whilst a contract might require that a vendor exercise reasonable care, the novelty of agentic AI means that, and the rapid development of it, means that the standard and norms around what's expected is quite unknown at the moment. And further, in practice, it might be difficult for vendors to negotiate, or for buyers to negotiate with vendors the terms of their contracts, and the risk might just be unacceptably high for your organization. But what we're actually seeing is that concerns about liability are being outweighed at the moment by fears of being left behind technologically. In other words, regardless of the risk, companies are just proceeding with AI adoption. However, the risks are exemplified by insurance companies significantly reducing or excluding altogether the scope of insurance cover for agentic AI. They consider the risk to be too high, given the unpredictability and its opacity, and the lack of certainty as to who is liable if things go wrong. So moving on from liability allocation onto third-party sites and computer misuse. So when an AI agent is crawling the web, as we had in our demo earlier, it's usually conducting disguised automated browsing and scraping. So in our example, the agent was buying various items from online retailers. But there's a high risk that when an agent does this, it commits a terms of service breach if it's automating shopping on a site that forbids agents from doing so. And this has been exemplified by Amazon's recent claim against Perplexity AI. Perplexity is an AI startup which has an automated shopping tool, and it can place orders on behalf of users. Amazon claims that Perplexity has been accessing its customers' accounts and disguising the activity of AI agents as human browsing. Amazon's position is that the use of agents in this way is a breach of its conditions of use, and that it also is in breach of certain American legislation on computer fraud. Now, superficially, it seems quite odd that a company like Amazon would be concerned about a tool that's helping execute sales on its website. But really, Amazon's concern is about control. It's worried about the disintermediation risk that occurs when AI agents are conducting shopping on behalf of its customers, because it loses control over the process and its ability to influence buyers' decision making. And it also reduces the impact of their IP. The case is ongoing, so we don't have an outcome yet, but it highlights some of the complications associated with the sudden unleashing of AI agents on the internet. In terms of mitigations and controls, these are best embedded on a technological level and enshrined contractually. Agentic AI should be designed to respect license APIs and access data via license aggregators in order to minimize the risk of breaching individual licenses. It also should be designed to respect robot terms. And this is actually quite a live issue because it could significantly constrain the efficacy of AI agents if a website prohibits them from engaging with their systems entirely. But we expect there will be licensing in this area. So, for example, ChatGPT is striking deals with e-commerce sites in order to have its shopping feature. And Perplexity is unlicensed, and that's what Amazon's problem is with it. So that's a snapshot of some of the liability issues that are generated by Agentic AI. I'll now hand over to Vic, who will move on to AI governance.
Thanks, Naomi. So in the time available, I'm going to just talk a little bit about AI governance. In particular, just 3 principles which I think are pretty well understood and part of most risk management frameworks today. And I'm just going to cover why they seem to work well enough for Gen AI and machine learning. What about Agentic might mean that we might need to rethink how those principles work as we move into the year, and also just allude to some concepts around risk mitigation, which I think we'll hear more of as we move through 2026. So the first principle in AI governance, which is often enshrined, as you see, is this concept of human in the loop. I won't go into detail on it too much, except to say for Gen AI, it's often a key condition on approving a use case to say, look, the human's going to be able to choose the use case for which it generates an output. It's going to be able to review that output itself before it gets used in the real world. So human in the loop kind of works well enough. For Agentic, and Jamie alluded to this, but some of the business case and benefit is going to be allowing the tool to work more autonomously. So that does seem to be at odds with how to insert a human in the loop. If you insist on having that at every step, you start to negate and dilute the business case benefit for doing it in the first place. Another point here which makes it different is harm can occur in the middle of a task or process, not just at the end, the point an output's generated. So at a point where it's possibly before it's possible for a human to observe what's happening behind the scenes or to intervene. So potentially harder to implement human in the loop in practice than with generative AI. And finally, this idea that it might be impractical at scale to do human in the loop. If the business case benefit is to do something like processing invoices on a scale of thousands in real time, and you insist on actually inserting human in that process every time, it negates that use case. It just isn't really viable. Having said that, the risk of not doing it is clear. A startup earlier this year, last year, reported that some agentic systems it was using to conduct research and analysis got into this recursive loop and just spoke to each other constantly for days and days, while all the human users thought it was acting just as it should. Burning compute time and racking up a bill of hundreds of thousands of dollars without anyone knowing about it, because no one could observe how it was interacting to the outside world. It was acting and producing the analysis as it should. Risk mitigations, I'm just going to hover over these concepts. I think we're going to hear more about them in this coming year. This idea of human on the loop and human in command when it comes to Agentic. So with human on the loop, we mean things like approval gateways, this idea of setting in the control panel of Agentic system the points at which a system has to hand back to a user for approval. For example, purchasing decisions, executing contracts, things like that, hitting upper spend limits. Also part of this is allowing a system to understand what is a business as usual expected behavior, what sits outside that as an outlier, as an edge case or a margin case, and at that point handing back to a user to verify what's going on to increase observability. I think we'll hear more about these these things. And human command is more about a principle of saying, well, rather than acting as a fully autonomous agent, why don't we look at the AI tool as a powerful tool, but not truly autonomous? So putting very hard boundaries on what it can access, what it can do, and limits on things like time and cost to keep a human in command. And we sort of cheated in our demo a little bit, because what we didn't show up front is this concept of the control panel that I mentioned. At the outset of using a platform, being able to set and configure it in a way that's going to work for you to try and embed and enshrine some of these mitigations up front. And I think we'll see the governance world move on that this year. So I'll just move on to the second concept here, explainability, accountability. Jamie touched on some of these principles from a privacy perspective, but from a broader risk perspective, really for traditional AI like Gen AI, let's call it traditional AI now, but it's basically trying to answer the question of why did the model say what it said? And I think that works well enough in the sense that the accountability chain is kind of clear enough. You can track what the user prompt was. You know what version of a model you use. You can see the generated output and the governance wrapper around that. And if you're the kind of organization that needs to disclose or label how you're using Gen AI for dealing with consumers, or you want to make sure you don't mislead, you can just do that, right? You can just do that. With Agentic, the question shifts towards why did the system act like that? Why did it do that rather than what did it generate? And some of the difficulties here lie in some of the reasoning parts. I think we're starting to see here that the complexity of driving behavior is multifaceted and multi-component. Naomi touched on it from a liability perspective, the number of components and players and parties that govern and guide the behavior. If it does go wrong, it's just not very transparent to work out who is accountable for that or what was accountable for that. And that leads us on actually to regulatory compliance, because key principle AI governance, we want to comply with the law, right? And in a way that works well enough for Gen AI when we're dealing with outputs, because you can make sure that the way people use outputs is compliant with data protection or sector-specific laws. You can enshrine those in policies and they work as well as they're going to work. I think with Agentic, you're talking about the compliance of the conduct it undertakes, because we've seen that agents can create legal exposure by the way they autonomously act. And there's this idea of cross-jurisdictional. Agents operating at scale to get the benefit you want them to are going to cross borders and systems very easily, engaging and triggering a whole gamut of laws and regulations, which often are not going to be very well harmonized in terms of the governance process. Record keeping is a challenge too. It's probably harder because you're not only having to keep a record of what was generated, but what was done and when and by who and under what authority. And if keeping accurate records is going to be difficult, it's going to be harder if you're highly regulated to explain and defend a decision to use an agentic system to a regulator for anything that's got a touch point with customers or regulatory compliance. I think the risk mitigation in this area is going to evolve again back to our control panel, setting authority controls, setting the kind of legal acts the system can and can't do, and it may well be none, especially at the outset. And compliance by design workflows. I think we'll talk about it in the third session this afternoon on contracts, but some of the suite of services we see coming out are actually more like agentic platforms that allow the customer buy side to develop their own agentic workflows. And if you've got that kind of control, if that's what your product teams are doing, there's an ability to embed compliance and risk controls in the way they design agents, as opposed to just receiving what's out of the box from a vendor. So that was a canter through some governance principles and how I think this is going to evolve as agentic gets more embedded into technology and the governance is going to have to catch up.